think that it's very similar to the thought of a preacher using a sermon in one area, and then if he goes and fills in for another congregation, he may use the same sermon. But with that congregation, especially with Jesus, the hearts that he knew, he would sort of retool on the fly. One of the most insulting things I've ever seen, to me at least, in terms of thinking about Jesus, there are scenes in that show, that TV show, The Chosen, where Jesus is asking Matthew to help him out with his sermons. Give me some feedback, help me, what would be the best way to blah, blah, blah. The idea is absurd to me. Now, again, I'm not saying that Jesus never asked his apostles what they thought. Certainly that was the case. But the idea that Jesus was just kind of like he needed some help or something, I think Jesus could say at any position, at any point, what anybody needed to know. Because he knew all men's hearts. He was divine. And so we want to keep that in mind. And that goes along with what we're saying here this morning. I appreciate Jonathan reading that passage. And the way it starts, again, this is his invitation. This is the end of his sermon. He's saying this is really what it comes down to. And he leaves it in his audience's laps. But Luke's account inserts this verse in verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? You call me Lord. You say I'm in control, but then you're not acting like I'm in control. You're acting and you're doing something different. You're doing something else. And then if we look over at chapter 7 of Matthew, look there with me. Matthew 7. Matthew chapter 7. Again, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, we're looking in verse 21. Very similar statement to Luke, but not exactly the same. Matthew 7:21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. And it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Another possible title for this lesson might be The Foundations of Life, because one of the some beauties of this parable, you think about how valuable it is and how easy it is to understand. The picture I have up there of the fella making sure the ditch of the foundation is the right level and everything. Keep that image in mind. We're going to touch on that in a minute. But we want to consider the value of this parable. You think about what's going on. The concealment of that foundation. I'm sorry, I didn't even have that up yet. Keep that image in mind. I was looking at the next image I have in my display here. My apologies. That image of the fella digging the ditch, laying the foundation. That's what we're going to talk about today. Sometimes we got to take a step back and think about, okay, what is my foundation? What am I built on? And if I find that it's lacking in some way, maybe I need to kind of go back. Say, what is that foundation? Sometimes we might have a good foundation, but we've built something rickety up above that. Maybe we need to go back and say, wait a minute, that's not right. Let's tear all that down. Let's get rid of that. And let's build up in the way God wants me to. Let's build up in the way that God shows me how to build. And I think there's great value in the parable that Jesus uses here. Because the concealment of that foundation hides the truth from those who are conceited, self-serving, those who are worldly. You look at these two edifices, these two buildings, and you can't really see what the foundation is, can you? I mean, unless I suppose there are situations where you can talk to somebody who knows about foundations, and they can look at a building and say, ooh, that's a problem there. And then you see a crack or something that you may not see. But Jesus, from the way it says here, you might look at these two houses that are being built and say, oh yeah, they both look good. The problem was not in the building of the houses per se, it was where the building started. And if that foundation is concealed, it's harder to see. And so those who just want what they want and want to go through life and do whatever they want, it's easy for them to pass by that. And the other aspect is the clarity of it. Jesus makes a vivid picture of the point under study. He uses common illustrations to bring the lesson in an obvious, striking way. And the lesson to be learned from these passages, and I just want out the barrel, let's just make it clear. Our lesson from these passages is, we can have no foundation in Christ if we do not obey Him. If I don't obey Jesus, that's a problem with my foundation. If I don't follow what He says, there's a problem with my foundation. I have to go back. And do, this is on my mind right now because I got some stuff recently. Y'all know my house is sort of on a hill there. We got some cracks here and there in the concrete. And some of them have been there kind of the whole time I've been here, but it's definitely increased since I've been there in the last 3 or 4 years. And I need to fill in some of those cracks. Now, probably the best way to fix the house would be something very expensive to support from underneath and get people to actually properly fix the problem. But even then, there's sort of an inevitability there, right? You're always going to have foundation problems building a house like that where it is. But my point is here, when we recognize that I have disobeyed Jesus, that should take us to look internally and say, where am I really? And to reflect on myself. And consider who is being taught by this parable. He says in this passage, whoever. In the Old King James, whosoever. It's not a point where I can excuse myself and say, well, I can have cracks in my foundation because I've just got a lot of pent-up problems with the way that I was raised. I've just got a lot of issues, and I just got this and I got that going on. No. Don't we realize that Jesus can help us with those things? Don't we realize that a life in Christ that's stable in Him will help us to deal with those things? I don't get a pass to heaven through my weaknesses per se. That's not an excuse. What I do is admit those weaknesses and pledge myself fully committed to God, fully committed to the kingdom of Christ. 100%. There is no excuse for that. And that's when, as Paul says in the Corinthian letters, that's when my weaknesses actually become strengths, because God will help me through that. I have problems with certain emotional aspects and depression, things like that. There are brethren in this world who are trained mental health experts. And you can reach out to those brethren. If you need somebody, you can talk to me. I know who you can talk to get in touch with somebody. And the reality is, and that's not just because of me, but it's because of a situation where we have to trust in God. And if I need that help, especially if it's a mental or an emotional aspect where I'm recognizing some things that are faulty, I need my brethren. I need my brethren to at least point me to somebody that isn't going to tell me, well, you know what your problem is you're following this Bible. Foundations. Consider whoever is taught. The context identifies that the hearing, the doing, the building is the work of a man. The passage here is not talking about the church building these houses for people. It's talking about the person. And so this passage answers the question, how can I live my life individually so as to obtain the security and stability that will protect me even during the severest of trials, the most adverse of circumstances? We have to recognize that I need to be able to answer the question, what will I do if the local church I attend becomes unfaithful to God? What will I do? What would we do if the Golden Springs Church of Christ, Lord forbid, ever turned against the Word in a collective sense? Now, hopefully, we have enough sense that we're not going to let that happen. And hopefully, we as men of the congregation will be the leaders we need to be to shepherd this church. Not as elders per se, because we just don't have elders right now, but from the standpoint that that responsibility falls upon our shoulders to do so. So the question is, how are we going to do that? We're only going to do that if we, as individuals, have the right kind of foundation. So, we need to be able to answer these questions. What are we built upon? Where do I get that building? And what's going to happen if something horrible like that occurs? I need to be ready. Let's make the distinction, and we've made the distinction before. We even made some of this distinction this morning during our Bible class, between institutions and individuals. Now, I'm using that term. Sometimes among us, the term institution is a loaded term, right? Because we think of ourselves as non-institutional. But really, the local church is an institution, isn't it? Now, the difference is, it is a God-ordained institution. It's a group that we have decided to come together and associate on this level and get the work of God done in this area. And that's why I say, when we think about this, we need to consider the distinctive between the collective and the individual. You know, foundations are inevitable. Just as we mentioned this morning that authority is inevitable. If I don't serve God, if I don't seek for His authority, I'm going to serve something else. I'm going to serve somebody else. On the same basis, foundations are inevitable. There are people in this world that are making decisions determined upon their own faith concerning what they teach children in the classroom. Those people that are teaching children in the classrooms, frankly, things that should not be taught to children, sharing things and images to them that should not be shared with children, they have a foundation. They have a moral and ethical foundation in their mind. Now, it's not from God. It's not from God, but they have a foundation. They are built up in this other institutional mindset that says, well, you know, obviously any kind of normal gender roles, that's just oppression, and we, you know, so on and so forth. We talk about that, we read about that. But institutions and individuals are built upon some sort of foundation. And what that means is these are basic principles by which they exist, according to which it pursues its aims and activities. We all, every single one of us has a foundation. Every body you look at in the world, they have a foundation. And that garners, that controls what they're going to say, what they're going to think, how they're going to do things. And so the thing is, we already have a foundation, even today. We all have a foundation. The question is it the right one? Is it the right foundation? And if it is the right foundation, we go back to this, well, I based everything on, is it in good repair? Are there cracks that need to be fixed? Are there things that we need to look at? And certainly we see that. And we see that all throughout time. You think about national Israel and individual Israel. God called His people out of Egypt. How did He call them? As individuals? Well, yes, but mainly as a collective. He said, "You are my people, and I will take you to a land of milk and honey," right? That's what He said. He gave them a national identity, a national law, a national homeland, and national blessings and cursings. This collective strength, it preserved every individual Jew through shared worship, through sacrifices, daily interactions, the conflicts they had, receiving divine blessings or cursings based upon collective behavior. But within that, there was also individual responsibility. Even though the collective emphasized that thing, each Jew was expected to develop personal strength and holiness, which guided his personal life and those aspects of life when he acted toward or as part of the collective. And His plan, God's plan, was for each individual to grow and develop so that he could stand alone. And the time came when the collective no longer followed God and suffered national cursing. This is what happened with David and Goliath. The collective, the people of Israel, were unwilling to stand up to this giant. But David, as an individual, he was so close to God and loved God so much that this probably 16 or 17-year-old young man, he stands before Goliath. He says, you come to me with a spear and a sword, but I come to you with the Lord God. And you defied him. You defied his people. He had courage, yes, but he didn't have courage based upon what the collective did. As national disobedience progressed, we find that the prophets later warned of collective punishment, but they emphasized individual faithfulness. Moving forward to the time of the divided kingdom in Judah alone, you see a distinction between, even in times where Judah had good kings, like King Josiah, what was said about the people in his reign. Well, God talked about them in the book of Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah, especially in Jeremiah, where they have returned to me in pretense. Their hearts are not fully back with me. They're going along to get along. You know, the king said, we'll do this. Okay, we'll do this. But their hearts were still with the idols. And so once Josiah was gone, there was nothing to stop anything. Because it was the hearts of the people, the individuals themselves. And there's just a number of things to think of there. Even in terms of, even a little bit earlier than Josiah. You think about King Ahab. I'm amazed by the grace that God showed King Ahab. This guy who had state-sponsored idol worship. He was allowing the killing of God's prophets in northern Israel. And yet, when he warned Ahab through Elijah the doom that would come to his family line and the horrible things that were going to happen to his sons and to his wife, you know what Ahab did? He collapses. And he mourns. He's grieving. And God says to Elijah, you see what Ahab's doing there? He says, because he has this reaction, I'm not going to bring these things about in his life. He waited till Ahab died to do those things. What a God of grace. He had absolutely no reason to withhold that punishment from Ahab. That shows us he cares about the individual. He looks at the individual and he knows your heart. He knows your foundation this morning. He knows where your cracks are. He knows where your problems are. And so we need to listen to these things. National failure didn't necessarily mean personal rejection by God, nor did it automatically indicate personal failure. And I think one of the best demonstrations of this potential disconnect between individual and nation is shown in the book of Ezekiel. And we won't turn to these passages to look very deeply, but I do want to look at, in particular at chapter 18 of Ezekiel. You might turn to Ezekiel 18. Just to get a flavor, because we just don't have the time to cover these chapters like we might want to. But if we look at Ezekiel, and we're looking at Ezekiel chapter 18. Ezekiel chapter 18. Ezekiel 18 and verse 4. We were in here just the other day in the Zoom study, by the way. Ezekiel 18 and verse 4. God says, behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins shall die. Notice he doesn't say there, the country that sins shall die. Now, is that true? Will God take a faithless nation that's rebelling against him? Will he cause calamity to come upon it? Absolutely. He punished the Assyrians. He punished the Babylonians. There is no doubt about that. But we need to recognize in the writing of Ezekiel here, Ezekiel is making it clear to the people that yes, as a nation we failed. But if you do right, God will bless you. What an encouraging thought. I am not defined by even the local congregation I'm a part of. We'll get more to that in just a minute. There's a nuance there I want us to keep in mind, because yes, where I am a member, that does affect me at some point. But there is a place where I think we see some distinction there that we'll see in just a minute. So the individual, under the old law, in Judaism, he had to learn to survive spiritually without the help and support of the collective. And God's teaching and his instructions provided for that. What was the point of the old law? To show us what sin is. What was the goal of it? To lead every individual that followed God under the old law to the Messiah to say, this is the way you need to go. There is no salvation in going through and trying to make yourself righteous by following the old law. It will never work. And even people in the Old Testament recognize that. That wasn't a fault for the law. The law had its purpose. But the beauty is, I come to Christ in the same way that people in the Old Testament who faithfully followed God, they came to Christ as well in their own way. But we do have a New Testament example about the church and the individual. The functional collective under the gospel is the local congregation, and each individual disciple is expected to associate, to be a member of a congregation for mutual edification, for work, and for bearing fruit. We're expected to depend upon each other for exhortation, for encouragement, and for correction. We're to serve the church. We're to be ministers of one another. You know, it's not just about the preacher doing everything. It's about personal conduct that benefits all of us. Love and devotion and care for each other. Looking out for each other. Making sure that everybody has a place here. That nobody feels neglected or overlooked. We're to serve one another. And we reprove and we rebuke one another as occasion demands. And similar to the Old Testament, each individual has to grow in such a way as to be able to stand alone spiritually when the collective grows weak or ineffective, or worse, if the collective strays from God's will. That's why those questions at the beginning are so important. What would I do if the collective work started to turn a different way? What would I do? I have to know the answer to that. A good collective or congregational climate will provide a fruitful atmosphere with which to seek personal growth and continuing divine approval. You see, the situation is that our job is to promote, and if I may use the term culture, we need to promote a culture within our local congregation that benefits each member in order to stimulate and provoke spiritual growth. Does that make sense? That we need to recognize that our task here is to make sure that we have an environment where faithful people can come in, or we teach them and they become faithful disciples. We're encouraging them to become better disciples. You know, we kind of bemoan evangelism sometimes. Sometimes it feels like we're just making better Baptists. Maybe that's what we're doing, is we're teaching good things to people that are going to other churches and sharing those good things with them. Okay, but you know, when we have brethren among us, we need to make a priority for them and care about them because they're our family. And we want them to do better. Sometimes the survival or well-being of the collective depends on the strength of a few individuals. Again, we're going to look at a couple of passages in just a minute. There are times when the very survival of the church as a collective depends upon the faithful few among its number who have strengthened themselves individually. Those whose house is built upon a rock or who have digged deep are then essential to the ongoing well-being of the collective. We need stable brethren. And each one of us needs to become a stable brother or sister. Someone who others can look at and say, okay, and we might get nervous about that. Oh, I don't want to be the one that, other people look to. I'm sorry, we don't have a choice. God says, no, you need to build up to where you're helping others and you're being that good voice in someone's life. That you're encouraging them, that you're there for them, that you care for them deeply. And that's not something you do just because, oh, well, I like this person so much. It doesn't necessarily have to revolve around that. They may be hard to get along with. But your Lord has said, you edify them. Everything must be done for that purpose. And so there are times when a strong collective supports the weak among its individual members. There are times when strong individuals help sustain and support otherwise weak congregations. I want us to consider briefly this morning. This is just on my mind because Brother Ken and I have been studying through Revelation recently. And look at Revelation 2. Revelation 2, I want to think about a couple of churches here where we see a distinction, what I think is a very clear distinction between the collective and the individual and how that dynamic plays out. So if you remember the church at Thyatira, toward the end of chapter 2 of Revelation, we're looking at Revelation chapter 2, and the letter to Thyatira begins in verse 18. And what God is saying to them, what Jesus is saying to them is that they're allowing people among them to teach the doctrine of Balaam. Basically to encourage the eating of idol meat in the temple. I think the implication would be this is a sinful observation. We know other places where Paul says that, hey, it's just meat. If you buy it in the marketplace, it's just meat. And we recognize that. But there was a distinction in buying meat from the marketplace and going to the temple itself and sitting down and eating that idol meat and partaking in the religious observances toward that idol god. And so I think that's what he's talking about. Fornication would be involved with that as well. But I want to notice particularly in verse 24, because it wasn't everybody in Thyatira that was going along with this. In verse 24, now to you I say, and to the rest in Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put on you no other burden, but hold fast what you have till I come. See, Jesus is making a distinction right there. He's saying you have this faction within the church that's encouraging sin, that's encouraging worldliness, all these things. And perhaps it was a go-along to get-along mentality. There's some historical speculation there. But the point is, he recognizes, as many of you don't have this doctrine, you hold fast. You hold fast till I come. And what's interesting is, in the letter, he's saying he is going to come. He is going to come and handle Jezebel. Now, did Jesus literally go to Thyatira in bodily form? And not necessarily, but I think what this is talking about is the sense that he's going to send people there. There's going to be some teachers brought there that will essentially fight back against this false doctrine. And what he's telling to those brethren that have not yet taken part in this, he's saying, hey, you hold fast. You stay strong against this evil. And so we recognize there, first of all, there's a time where, yes, there's a problem in the collective church. There's a doctrinal discord there. But there is a time and place where you've got the need for faithful brethren to actually stay there. And perhaps there would be the thought that, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with this, and maybe they would have left the congregation. I think there is a time to stay. There is a time to leave. If that becomes something that just the collective as a whole seems to go along with this, and it just seems to be the way it's going, okay, we've got to make a break there. But there is a place where we need to stand and fight, and we need to stand for the truth. On the same basis, in terms of Sardis, in chapter 3, Sardis is designated in a sense where they have a name that they're alive, but they're actually dead. They're a dead church. They're not doing what God wants them to do. They've held back on their growth. And then we see in verse 4, he's commanding them to repent in verse 3. And then in verse 4, he says, you have a few names, even in Sardis, who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments. So even though the general record was that Sardis was a dead church, perhaps had failed in various areas in terms of keeping up the faith and being strong like they need to be strong, there were others within the church, individuals that God was recognizing. They're faithful. They're holding strong to me. So we want to keep that in mind. And again, I really want to stress this. What I'm saying here doesn't mean that we just stay in the church and stay in the church no matter how bad things get. Not necessarily the case. But I think there is a point to be made where we do need to stay and fight the truth as much as we can, fight falsehood against the truth, fight for the truth, as long as we can. So much depends on individual growth, individual strength. Because you think about those scenarios in Sardis and in Thyatira, why did those people stand up against it? Because they had prepared themselves beforehand. They had been taught the right thing, and they held fast to the doctrine that God had handed down through the apostles. There are some severe consequences of lack of growth. Perhaps we have trouble from carnal attitudes, contentious, divisive behaviors that disrupt peace. Perhaps errors in teaching, even if unintentional, they can lead to trouble, highlighting the need for maturity and a foundation on the rock to navigate through conflicts to maintain purity and peace from a biblical standpoint. And so I say this morning, you need to dig deep in your foundation. You need to dig deep. Don't just set it on a little bit. You know, the personal thought I have about this, digging deep takes effort. We had to bury our cat earlier this year, and the place we picked just so happened to be a spot where there was a big clay deposit there. And it was just really rough. And I was so thankful for Jericho coming and helping me, you know. And we were getting our tools and stuff, and I've got a little pick, and Dad said, he says, Dad, do you think, can we bring that along? And I said, I don't think we'll need that pick. I think well, we got about an inch down. We got into that hard clay. I said, Jericho, go get that pick, please. And so there was a little while where I was busting up the clay, and Jericho was shoveling it up. I was busting up the clay, and Jericho was shoveling it up. We needed to get it deep enough so that something would come along and dig up, or dig cat. And so I was thankful for his help there. But digging deep does take effort. It takes hard work. You know, I had a personal example from Aubrey Ballou. Apparently, early in his life, he worked as a ditch digger to build houses. And keep in mind, this probably was back in the 40s. He was born in 1930. So I don't know how typical it was. I don't think they had really tiny, backhoes back then. So likely these were big jobs. And digging out the trenches that would be filled with cement as a foundation for the house. And difficult back-breaking effort that had to be sustained over hours of hard labor until the footing was finished. And in the part of the country where he was working, in central Illinois, they had to understand where the frost line was. They had to dig the trench deep enough to be below the frost line. And he says in his memory, he said in the notes here, I think it was 42 inches or some such terrible number. So I can imagine, you think all day you're digging, you think 42 inches, about 3.5 feet. And I looked up too, states like Minnesota, North Dakota, and Alaska have some of the deepest frost lines, sometimes about to 100 inches, about 8 feet. Imagine having to dig a trench 8 feet down there. So completing that foundation was a time of relief and reward, and you could go on to the next stage in the building of a house. But building a life is much more complicated from one perspective, and it's simple from another. And so many things go into that task. We all are working on our foundations, even now. And we all contribute to the final stability and strength of that structure. If you get the foundation wrong, as I understand, I don't think you'll ever get the house right. And you'll always keep having trouble there. But we don't need to be conscious of them all. Just remember that it involves, in sense of us building this house, it involves hearing the sayings of Jesus and doing them. That's as simple as it can get, right? Digging deep requires not just effort, it requires purpose. This place and process involved in digging a foundation. Brother Jeremy, I'm sure, knows a lot about this as well, and Brother Scott in building his house. You got to pick the right place. You got to find that place, and you start with this field, and the contractor will select this place, and then precisely mark the width and the length of the various sides of the foundation. And usually, when the digger comes in, there's already a group of strings laid out that precisely mark the area to dig. Nothing is left to chance in that scenario. Every move is planned. And it's the same way with the life of a Christian. There's a pattern. There's an ideal life to which we must all aspire. And the pattern is from divine planning, from God's planning. And it's going to be sought after intentionally by the true disciple of Christ. In a sense, we start out as an unmarked field. God looks at us and He designs to build upon us, and we need the proper foundation. And sometimes brush and thorns need to be rooted out. In our pre-Christian life, we've developed habits and attitudes that must be replaced with those demanded by the instructions of God. We need to enter that process aware that major changes are required. I remember a brother telling me that one of the reasons he was converted, that a Baptist, he called it a Church of Christ preacher, told him as he was at the Baptist church, he says, "You're getting 99 cents over there. You need to come over here and get the full dollar." I don't think that's a very good pitch point personally, because that doesn't show the distinction there. when you become a Christian, you are reborn. You are a new creature. And of course, the brother was trying to ask me, what can I take from my background as a Baptist? And, my answer was just sort of like, well, you kind of start over. But that said, you may find that some of the things that you find go along with what you had before. Okay, that's fine. But the point is not, I just have to shift a few things here and there. I think that's a really damaging thing when we start to think that. This is a new reawakening. This is you becoming something completely different. And so we must practice true humility that submits without defensiveness to identifying the shortcomings that need to be overcome. Pioneer preacher Raccoon John Smith, I've shared this quote before, but he said once, if the gospel is so plain as you say it is, why do you have to labor so hard to get people to understand it? Smith replied, I've often prepared ground in the wilderness for a turnip patch. And though I had the kindest soil and the best seed, and the sowing was easy, I never got top nor root till I first took my axe and hoe and briar knife and went in and hacked and grubbed and cleared the ground. The Lord knows I do not esteem it hard to preach the simple gospel to those who are prepared to receive it, but it is labor indeed to root out prejudice and cut down the systems and clear away the sectarian trash that cumbers the minds and hearts of the people. As Jesus said in Luke 14, whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. We have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the foundation? In terms of the parable, it's to provide stability and endurance throughout the storms of life, the difficulties of life. That foundation will hold you strong. And with a proper foundation, we're not surprised or overwhelmed by situations that arise. How we act at these times has to be in harmony with the spiritual principles that should underlie our entire life. Everything we do. Think about it. Faith, gentleness, grace, easy to be entreated. All these things, our self-control, our forbearance, all of that needs to be constantly kept in view. And I'm not saying that from the standpoint that I've got to be like Radcliffe, I've got to be exact, I've got to be perfect every single... No. Trust in God. Trust in His grace. Where you fail, He's there as well. And that will actually give you a stronger stance. Because I'm going to tell you right now, if I'm just standing on my ability to perfectly do these things, I will fail.
Amen.
And I don't have that I don't have that strength within myself. I'm weak, and I need God's help. And so we must admit that. Digging deep involves persistence, and this goes right along with it as well. Contrary to an earthly foundation, which can be finished at one point, then to be built on in another phase, the spiritual foundation of our life can't just be established initially. I can't just come out of the baptistry and say, well, that was good. I'm glad I've got everything I need. And no, it's an ongoing process, isn't it? There's a constant aspect there. It needs to be continually strengthened and added to all the way through your life. And in reference to the conditions of participation in the kingdom and fundamental truths, the foundation can be laid and left behind to the next stage. We need to be careful about that. We have building blocks of growth and maturity. They must not only be acquired, they must also be nurtured continually and built up to provide even greater input into our lives. Peter talks about this. He says, for this very reason, giving all diligence, all watchfulness, all vigilance. Add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. For if these things are yours and abound, you will be neither barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have development in our lives as Christians. There's no point you get to where you're done. Digging deep means setting priorities. Apart from work and sleep, there's only so many hours in a day and only so much time to be given to life's activities. And the most important work we can do is to lay a proper foundation for the rest of our lives. Sometimes it's not just a matter of time involved. It's also recognizing a matter for its relative importance, to recognize that, okay, this is what I need to deal with before I deal with other matters. I think about this in terms of the eldership. The brother who is an elder, whose children fall away, or one child, I believe, falls away from the Lord, what is his priority at that moment? Now, some might say, well, he just needs to stay with the work at the church and keep working in that position. But I would say that if his son has fallen away, that becomes his priority. That becomes his work. And in such a way, it's not a sense where he's just automatically can never be an elder again. But it's from a standpoint that, okay, I have other matters that I need to tend to right here. And to recognize the failure of that for yourself and to work and to strive to correct that. Sometimes it involves taking a direction or engaging in a particular act at a great cost to our self-esteem, our personal resentment. Forsaking personal feelings for collective good is really a routine demand placed upon us, which means acting from a proper foundation. There is a contextual point here about this foundation. Jesus, by this parable, he represents the life which withstands the worst times in life. I have to think that what really should have happened there after the time of the Sea of Galilee, when the storm came up, and the apostles are saying to Jesus as he's asleep in the back on the pillow, they're saying, Master, don't you care that we're about to die? You would hope that they would have more trust for Jesus after that, since he could rebuke the wind. But I don't think they really truly did, at least not until the resurrection. I think in the resurrection it all fell into place. And they trusted in him. They knew that he would be there for him. And you think about this, each of these come at the end of an extensive discussion in both Gospels we read from of kingdom principles. You see, the Sermon on the Mount is a kingdom sermon. He expects his people to be kingdom citizens. And this is what the kingdom citizen looks like. So you consider these sayings of Jesus, where he says, Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are they that are persecuted for righteousness' sake. The Beatitudes are what a kingdom citizen should look like already. Like, that's what he's calling us to. That's the ideal. It's not a point where I say, well, maybe I can be like that someday. Our priority needs to be for this to be me right now. Now, if that's not me, and there's ways I need to improve, I need to be at work on that and to improve in those ways. And God has grace to help in time of need. And if you look at what the Bible is saying and you're recognizing that's not me, he has grace to help in time of need. That is a time of need. When you realize there's problems in my foundation, and you reach out to God and say, Lord, I see what you're trying to help me do. Help me accomplish it. And you might even have the prayer of that man with Jesus, with his son, where he said, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. That is a proper prayer, isn't it? To recognize that we need help. Further, Jesus says in these sermons, let your light shine before men. Do not hate, despise, or stay angry with your brother. Do not worship while at odds with your brother. Do not lust. Do not lie. Do not return evil for evil. Return evil with good. Go the extra mile in dealing with one another. Love your enemies. Do not hypocritically worship. Ask forgiveness by offering forgiveness. Lay up treasures in heaven. Be content with your lot. Put God first. Don't be judgmental. Don't throw the gospel away on the disinterested. Beware of false prophets. All of this factors into what we're talking about this morning. And so he goes on to say, and lays upon them, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, that's the one who has built his house upon a rock. Well, what does it ultimately mean to dig deep? Well, it means that success is not on top. I was thinking about this the other day, how so many times we might worry ourselves with things that are up here. We think about, it's kind of like we're building a house and we're dealing with foundation, and we spend all our time thinking about, okay, but what about the tiles of the roof? What about this up here? What about the... And sometimes we get into places where it's like, what's going to be going on in the sky above that house? Well, frankly, that's God's business. And we do that sometimes. Where we get worried about things that we can't control and we go beyond what we need to be working on. We get tired of working, we get sick of it, I'm just going to think about something else. And you're still thinking about, in your mind, you're thinking about the building of your house, but you're not taking care of what you need to take care of right now. Success is not on top. Usually, if something doesn't cost much, it's not worth much. And the man who built his house upon the sand, he chose the easy life. He had the little effort. I'm just going to work on the obvious, visible edifice. I'm just going to build that up, and people won't really know. Well, without sufficient attention paid to the underlying substance of his building, he suffered for it. And there may be a big difference between what appears and what actually is. It also means to get ready for hard times. We need to be ready for hard times, brethren. And I'm not saying that because I know something or that I'm prophesying something. I'm just saying that we have clear warnings to people, even in the first century, about preparing for hard times. And I think there are some parallels we can make to that. We don't have the time to go deep into that. But a solid foundation is not needed when there's no danger, when life is not without resistance. You could probably pick somewhere that would never really have any, would have fairly mild weather and maybe not have to worry too much about certain things. I know there are certain things, if you build a house down at the coast, I imagine there's a lot of different things to consider. If you're building a house by the Gulf of Mexico, especially if it's near a beach, you're going to want to take care of the level of that house. And just to see, is this going to be able to weather the storms and things like that? On the same basis, if you're in a mountainous area, you'll have to think about, okay, is this going to be able to deal with certain winds or certain stresses that area is going to have? But some people who live their lives up on the top, they're just worried only about appearances, being unmotivated to do it right. They live in the vain hope that shabby or superficial preparation will be enough to sustain them spiritually when the winds and the rain and the flood bombard them. Jesus calls them foolish. The one who fails to anticipate and strengthen himself for the trial. Jesus doesn't say the rain may descend and the wind may blow and the flood may come. He says that when they did come, and they will come. Digging deep also means penetrating the higher levels on which most depend. We need to dig under the worldly life. Some of us, even within the church, still have too much interest in the things of the world. And even that satisfaction doesn't survive the adversity. Jesus warns us so plainly in Luke 12:15, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." We need to dig under that worldly life. We need to dig under the carnal spirit, greed, selfishness, temperamental feelings and actions, the attitude of it's all about me. We need only reread the Sermon on the Mount to see how fruitless that spirit is. When we have anger that's unwarranted, or we have a hasty and rash reaction to the failures of others, that does not bring peace and a successful resolution regarding these things over which we might differ. We need to dig under those things, those feelings. We need to dig under the man-made crutches. Often a man's idea of religion doesn't supply a firm foundation which supports a proper spiritual condition. Have you ever talked to somebody about a Bible study and they say, "Oh yeah, I worship at this church"? And I'm like, well, that's not my question. I don't say that typically, but I was asking if you like to study the Bible, if you want to study the Bible. But people typically think that's the same thing. That's their foundation. They go to the church, and it's much more of a communal, community type thing. But religion's based on this empty sort of teaching that we hear of just love everybody and stand for nothing. Now, that's what seems to be taught sometimes. These have no value when attempting to apply the lessons of Scripture. And these religions have a loveless application of legalistic principles as well, where we're going to hold fast on certain things, but we do it not out of love. We do it out of, well, look at us, look at who we are. We need to dig all the way down to the rock. I remember the house we had in Columbus before we moved over here. In the crawl space, you could see the guy who built that house He had dug down to the rock of that hill, and he had set the house on that. You don't always see that per se. But it's always best to do that, isn't it? To recognize I need to get down to that point. And only in a knowledge of Jesus, only in heeding his message is there strength and solidness. I want to be a solid brother. And it would be interesting for us to look within ourselves when these times seem contentious. Very often the tendency when tough times happen, when tempers flare up, we start to think about others and what they're doing. We start to think about others in the most unhealthy ways. He did that to spite me. He did this to do that. But maybe we need to take a look within ourselves when feelings run high, when frustration and impatience take their toll. Ask ourselves, would Jesus appreciate me for feeling this way? Would Jesus appreciate me for acting this way? Am I glorifying him in this reaction? Are my eyes on Jesus alone? Is my heart devoted above all things to pleasing him? That's why it leads us to some final thoughts here. We need a foundational presence in action. The two epistles that Paul wrote to the congregation in Corinth deal with various aspects of a congregation divided. And one way or another, almost the entire first epistle defines and then offers a solution to the problem of division. And the second one deals with a serious effort on the part of the church to heal the wounds. And that's why it's good for us to look at it. But I want us to specifically consider some serious divisions that exist there. We read back through the first 4 chapters to see those serious divisions. And he says this in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 6. These things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one another. Well, what is the better way? The better way is love. In keeping in context of 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, turn there with me. The harshest words of Paul anywhere are reserved for carnally minded disciples who put their personal feelings above their congregational responsibility. But some of the sweetest words of reconciliation are commended to those people, some of those same people at least, for their response. In 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Sometimes this passage is read in weddings, and I think that's a fine passage to read. But let's remember in the context, Paul is talking to a local congregation of saints. And he's saying, this is how you work together. The key is love. It's not spiritual gifts. It's not things that we can pride ourselves about. It's love. Love tears down these walls. I want us to further look at 2 Corinthians 7, because love brought the brethren in Corinth to a wonderful place. Because we need to recognize, we need to read this passage, and we often think about it just in the context of the brother from 1 Corinthians 5, where it's like, okay, they had these serious issues, but they fixed that now, and that's great. I want us to think about this and think about this passage in a way that I want these feelings in my life right now. I want to feel the way Paul is talking about with these brethren. When I find that my foundation is not what it should be, when I recognize I need God's help to rebuild, maybe I've got to go back and replane the foundation and start over in some severe way. I think these words are helpful. Look in verse 10 of 2 Corinthians 7. 2 Corinthians 7, verse 10. For godly sorrow produces repentance, leading to salvation, not to be regretted, but the sorrow of the world produces death. For observe this very thing, that you sorrowed in a godly manner. What diligence it produced in you, what clearing of yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what vehement desire, what zeal, what vindication. In all things you proved yourselves to be clear in this matter. Therefore, although I wrote to you, I did not do it for the sake of him who had done the wrong, nor for the sake of him who suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear to you. Therefore we've been comforted by your comfort, and we rejoiced exceedingly more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all. For if anything I have boasted to him about you, I am not ashamed. But as we spoke all things to you in truth, even so our boasting in Titus was found true. And his affections are greater for you as he remembers the obedience of you all, how with fear and trembling you received him. These brethren, I think it's fair to say, were uprooted by Paul's efforts. And when Titus came to them, they were beside themselves. They recognized what they had done. And they were freely admitting what they had done wrong. I want us to think of this passage and think about, do I feel that way when I'm corrected by God? Is it a positive thing? Or am I feeling like, oh, I know I did the wrong thing, but I have all these problems and all these things, and we withdraw, and we build up these prideful walls in a way that doesn't look prideful. We try to act like we're the victim when really we may have been the cause behind it all. God helps us understand, I need to feel this way. I need to feel convicted. I need to feel when I've done something wrong. I need to feel bad. I need to feel guilty about those things. And if I don't, maybe there's something wrong there. Maybe the foundation is not what it should be. Think about this entirely. Jesus said these words so that we would all look at our own hearts. Not that we would just constantly point at other people. Well, I wouldn't have done that if they did this, if they hadn't done that. Or when there's a problem in the church and people leave. Well, you know where they left to. They didn't go anywhere faithful. That doesn't make your actions good. Let's understand that we work together in this kingdom for a purpose. And so let's have this and recognize that God is rooting for our success. And that success begins today with you obeying the gospel. Have you obeyed the gospel? Are you a Christian this morning? Do you stand for Christ in every way? Do you stand for Christ in your workplace? Do you stand for Christ among your family, at your school, wherever you're going? Do you listen to the conversations of others and try to bring the Lord into these conversations? Do you have that rock? Do you have that foundation? Are you ready if something terrible happens in your family? If one of your family members leaves the Lord, and the time comes when you have to follow the Lord's word as far as marking and withdrawing and things like that, even within your family, are you prepared to do that? If you're not, then may I gently encourage you to look at your foundation. If you haven't done those things, we want to encourage each other every day to lean on each other, to recognize, yes, we're going to have these problems, we're going to have these issues. That's why we need to be strengthened right now, take every advantage right now to be a part of everything that's happening with our local congregation. And so, if you need to obey the gospel, though, that hasn't yet happened yet. You know, in a sense, if you haven't died with Christ in baptism, that foundation isn't even really laid yet. You may have some things already there. There may be some things done, but let's dig everything out. Let's start anew if we need to. I think about this song that Brother John picked, the sense of no tears in heaven. And that's really the beauty here. As tough as it may have sounded, what we've been talking about this morning in terms of laying that foundation and building, and the difficult work that's involved, let's keep in mind that God doesn't expect this kind of work to go on forever. And the only reason this laying the foundation, the only reason it's so hard here is because of sin. Mm-hmm. But you know what? In heaven, we're not going to have to worry about that.
That's right.
The Lord will have taken all those temptations away.
Yes.
We will be changed. We will be different creatures. Mm-hmm. And God will have us in His home forever. And we will live forever to worship and glorify Him together. Mm-hmm. And we need to want to be there. We need to want to be there right now because we need to live as if we're already there. So this morning, if you need to obey the gospel in any way, if you need to respond to it, we encourage you to do so while we stand and sing.
No tears in